introduce to you the next speaker, which is Susan Bissell. Susan Bissell is leading an emerging global partnership to end violence against children. The primary purpose of the partnership is to end abuse, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence and torture of children. From 2009 through 2015, Dr. Bissell served as Chief of Child Protection in UNICEF Program Division, and she is the author of numerous research studies. She has worked with UNICEF in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in India, in Italy, at the Innocenti Research Center, and in New York City. She earned her PhD in Public Health and Medical Anthropology from the University of Melbourne, Australia. Please welcome Susan. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Arturo. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, Luigi, if you're still with us. Thanks to the National Academies for the opportunity to speak about the partnership, which a year ago was a germ of an idea and has evolved quite a bit since then. I'd also like to acknowledge Louise and her team for, as usual, excellent coordination and logistics and everything else, and substance, of course. And if you'll indulge me for just a second, I also want to do a couple of shout-outs for the support to the partnership so far. And that is to a group of foundations who call themselves Elevate Children, to WHO for engaging in the partnership wholly from the beginning, to SOS Children's Villages, World Vision International, Save the Children, and the Child Fund Alliance, all of whom have substantively supported the early work of the partnership, to UNICEF, of course, and to many others who have been involved from the beginning. The other thing I want to acknowledge before I get into the substance is David Stephen of the Center for International Cooperation in New York, and his team in the UK who've been supporting the partnership. And I want to thank Luigi for saying that you understand this may be a successful initiative. We're actually going to launch pretty soon, so if we're seeming successful so far, maybe we're on a good track. Whoops, I think I just went the wrong way. What did I do? There we go. So I want to walk you through the strategy for the partnership. And you heard Tony this morning, I think, say that out of the MDGs grew a number of health partnerships, like Gavi, like the Global Fund. And I think we're envisaging ourselves as some kind of hybrid of a number of existing and successful partnerships. To quote Tony Lake, UNICEF's executive director, I can't think of anything that's done more for the world's children than Gavi. And I'm fortunate enough to have a former governance advisor to Gavi working with me now, a former director of Gavi providing support as well in terms of results frameworks, and the Global Fund's marketing and branding strategist is also working with us. So I think we've got some of the best minds and experienced people when it comes to setting up these complex partnerships behind us. So these little symbols, I think we're all dipping into the same place where we put together our presentations, but I think the important thing to say about ending violence against children and the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think a point that's resonating with the Global Forum is that we're not talking about isolated goals one by one. Somehow they're all interlinked. And we are, when it comes to violence prevention in childhood, of course, very pleased, I mean, I would say almost euphoric to see language articulating the prioritization of the protection of children from violence, abuse, exploitation, neglect, torture, child marriage, female genital mutilation and cutting, and other aspects of where there are violent outcomes for children so clearly articulated. I think it was here last year that I quoted a colleague of mine by saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And that's what happened in the MDGs for all of the things that I think so many of us in this room and on the line care about. So these are just a smattering of examples, oh, I just did it again, of aspects of the agenda that are relevant. And I won't repeat them all for you. I think you'll have access to this PowerPoint as well. So the strategy, We have come a long way, I think, in the last few months, working with an interim governance structure, and it's made up of multiple stakeholders, the UN, civil society, governments, the private sector, leaders of the faith-based community, academics and researchers. And what we haven't quite figured out yet, although we have had consultation with young people around the world on our strategy, is how to legitimately, democratically, safely engage young people, youth, and children in the partnership. I'll come back to that later. So our vision, you can see, is pretty ambitious, but a world in which every child grows up free from violence and exploitation. Our mission, the partnership, aims to make society safer for children, protect childhood, and end violence against children everywhere. These are our principles. I won't just read them out, and our goals. And I think it's taken us a little while to really get to, we're now teasing out a results framework, and we are pretty clear about what it is we want to get done now. Our first goal is building political will. I'm going to get into these further. The second one, and the one that I'll dwell on most in this presentation, is we want to accelerate action. And this strategy that is devised and that I sent out last night, just before midnight, in its final form back to the interim governance, teases out, in particular, this accelerating action piece. And this is a strategy just for the first 5 years of what will be, I hope, a 15-year partnership to accompany implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The partnership is a means of implementation of Agenda 2030 when it comes to keeping children safe. And our third goal is strengthening collaboration. Our drivers, also unpacked in more detail in the strategy, include movement building, finance and resources, data and evidence, and monitoring and evaluation. Let's see if I can get this right this time. There we go. So under building political will, and as you can see now, we're getting into a deeper level of detail, and one of the things we're trying to do here is make sure that we can measure what it is we say we're trying to get done. This is an enormous challenge, as I'm sure all of you will understand. And so right now we're looking at building political will, sustaining political will to end violence against children, promoting evidence-based strategies that will lead to significant, sustained, and measurable reductions in violence. And we feel like as a field, and I think, as I mentioned when I was here last year, I've been at this for about 26 years now, and we've never had the kind of platform that we have right now, where there are existing movements, where there are existing fields of work that are evidence-based, and I'm thinking of our colleagues working in Together for Girls, where the colleagues that are working in Girls Not Brides and around the whole issue of early child and forced marriage. So within this goal, what we're hoping to see is all countries committing to action to end violence and exploitation of all children. Violence against children and actions needed to prevent them part of national, regional, and global discourse, and all countries seeing an increase in finances put towards ending violence and exploitation in all settings. These are pretty ambitious, and when we get to the next level of results, it gets a little more tricky in terms of how we're going to be able to measure them. We're actually bringing a group of measurement experts together at the beginning of June to tease out the results framework further. Accelerating action, and this is, as I said, I'm going to talk most about this here this afternoon. The partnership will work with partners to accelerate action to tackle the violence that children face, with a focus on pathfinder countries who wish to lead the movement to end violence. In our strategy, we introduced this concept of pathfinders, which is already proving to be incredibly challenging and political, and I'll explain that in a second. So we're looking at all countries adopting national legislation to protect children from violence and exploitation, including online violence, not something we talk about very much. Children in pathfinder countries accessing integrated services, and children affected by violence, including those in conflict settings, accessing child-centered services and programs. So what you can see here, and I think this is an important political statement of the partnership, is that we want to cover out all terrain. We're talking about children in low, middle, and high income settings. We're talking about children who are facing disasters and conflict, and we're talking about children in everyday life, as well as in the virtual lives that they lead online. That sounds pretty ambitious. it is. However, I think it is in this accelerated action space that we're not starting from zero. So we're acknowledging the good work that has come before us. We're acknowledging the work of existing partnerships and building on all of that. Oh, geez, not enough sleep last night. The third goal of strengthening collaboration is the one that I think holds great promise, and again, building on good practice. And what I mean by that is we're hoping to strengthen collaboration among and between countries and with civil society and other stakeholders, confronting shared threats and developing shared solutions. And some of that shared solution piece already exists. I think Jim mentioned this morning, but the work between and among CDC, UNICEF, PEPFAR, Together for Girls, a number of other partners, WHO, of course, leading the charge of putting together these interventions, these evidence-based solutions that we know work, and not, Elizabeth, to our earlier conversation, not with a view to cookie-cutter approach to applying those strategies, but to actually looking at what underlies those strategies, what the theories of change are, and what the interventions are. And so we want to create platforms for sustained transnational action and learning. I don't think Lisa Witter's with us, but we're looking with her group right now at how we create online sharing, and we use technology, among other things. Serve as a global forum for learning, standard setting, and mutual accountability, and generating and disseminating knowledge and evidence. We're planning a solutions summit at the end of next year just to kind of do a stock take, but we want to look at other innovative ways of achieving this particular goal so that we don't always have to be bringing people together face to face, but where we create learning among and between countries. So as I said, I wanted to dwell on accelerated action. So we introduced this strategy, this Pathfinder concept, and we didn't expect it to take off like wildfire the way it has. So we started to get letters from ministerial level and secretary level from governments around the world expressing interest in the partnership. And these are the flags of the countries from which we have these official letters. And so then what that triggers is a process of, we've developed guidance to Pathfinders. And so far they're Pathfinder countries, but we actually had an informal approach from the city of Chicago. We've been approached by SIVAC, the South Asian Violence Against Children Initiative, and a subset of SARC, of the regional body. We've also been asked by the Global Movement for Children, the regional movement in Latin America, could they be Pathfinders? So I think we're going to have to do a lot more work on pathfinding. The other issue around Pathfinders is that when we establish our board, which should happen over the coming weeks, we intend to have the first meeting on the 6th of June, although I don't know we'll make that deadline, but the board will actually bestow Pathfinder status on Pathfinders. And I mentioned that that's political because these letters are coming in saying, we want to be Pathfinders. And we've got, as you can see, quite a diverse list of countries here. And so civil society are holding feet to the fire and saying we have to have the highest possible standard for getting into the Pathfinder group. So we're now referring to this initial subset of countries as countries that are on the way to becoming Pathfinders. And the reason that's important is that the global partnership is going to support governments that are demonstrating a strong commitment to accelerating efforts to make children safe and are focused on solutions. And that's where this term is being used. These are early adopters of SDG 2030, of the SDGs, early adopters of the partnership strategies and principles. They will receive technical support to execute a whole-of-government approach to violence prevention. It will involve development of a roadmap for implementation of the package of evidence-based solutions that's been referred to, currently being called, I think, INSPIRE, and a national commitment to increased financing. And this is already proving incredibly complex but fascinating. So Tanzania is way out there, Indonesia, Sweden, and Mexico. I'm doing a mission to Mexico at the end of the month, and listening to Luigi, actually, I was thinking to myself, I'm so glad to Arturo, I'm so glad that there are people like Arturo on the ground in Mexico doing the work that you're doing. Otherwise, I think I'd be afraid to step off the plane. And a number of countries already initiating steps to becoming pathfinders. They're committing to confronting the many factors that leave children vulnerable to violence and helping build a global network of champions. They're pioneers. I think we're having very interesting political discussions in other countries, a couple of high-income countries in particular, who don't really want to talk about their domestic agendas. They're willing to look at this from an ODA perspective, but not as something that we all share. And for sure, Agenda 2030 is a test case for universality, and that's one of the things we want to do with this partnership, is to have countries of the global north and global south sitting together at a table, sharing solutions for problems that we all share. Here's a little glimpse at the package of interventions. It's not finalized yet. As I said, WHO is leading that charge. But I think pretty exciting, and this makes me a total nerd when it comes to protecting children. This is one of the most exciting things of the last couple of decades, where we can agree on stuff that we're going to have a common narrative when we approach our counterparts and other partners. So quickly, how we work in the partnership. The partnership is based on some clear principles of engagement and a commitment to providing a voice for stakeholders from all sectors. We've agreed that our governance will be as lean as possible, especially at first, and global structures will evolve as the partnership grows and changes. We currently have an interim advisory committee and a secretariat. The interim advisory committee is made up of 4 governments, as I said, and multiple stakeholders, with the exception of young people right now. That's going to morph over the summer into a 25-person board, which will be co-chaired by UNICEF's executive director and a female from the Global South of the highest possible level. The board, at the request of governments from around the world, would be 50% governments and the other 50% everybody else. And then there's going to be another group called the Executive Committee, which will be a smaller group of about 16 people who have decision-making authority in their institutions. Some of them may be on the board, doesn't have to be that way, but will have different skill sets that will help the Secretariat and help the partnership succeed. And we're setting all of that up right now. That was the other documentation that went out last night. And the board is expected to meet probably virtually for the first time in June. We'll see if we get there. A lot of interest, I have to say. We're kind of surprised. So this is where we are right now. The Secretariat is made up of secondees, supported by civil society, as well as some 3-year support from the Swiss government to second someone into WHO in Geneva, so that we have a satellite secretariat in Europe to do some of that other work. Another civil society secondee will come in for at least another year, possibly 2, to join that satellite secretariat. But this is, and I just want to stress that this is not a UN partnership. The Secretariat is housed in UNICEF for now. It needs a home so that it can get itself up and running, and that's why you'll see me with 2 hats on. I'm supposed to be wearing a partnership hat, so I now work for the partnership, even though I'm still somehow attached to UNICEF, and that's going to get interesting as we move ahead, and I'll explain why. So just to let you know, our launch is on the 12th of July in New York, and we'll have this Solutions Summit towards the end of next year. The only other thing I wanted to mention is there is an associated trust fund, as I had mentioned. It has its own governance structure. It has a steering committee that we're setting up at the same time. It has some seed funding from the UK government that will seed funding from the government of the UK that will focus in particular on online violence against children, online sexual violence against children. So we're now opening up 2 other windows in the trust fund. All of it is going to be directed to accelerating action, and that trust fund is to be accessible to civil society, to the UN, and to governments. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to working with all of you, and in particular to get this thing off the ground in the United States. I'm so excited about the prospects and look forward to working with you. Thank you.